Jill, thank you so much for joining us and your willingness to make the trip from Long Island to be here with us today. So we're really grateful for that and for Kurt being willing to do that for us tomorrow as well. We're going to start because we have, really a limited amount of time with you, just an hour, Jill. You told me that Kristallnacht that took place in November 1938 was the catalyst for the decision and the direction that your family's life took during the Holocaust and the war. You were very young at the time, just 5 years of age. Before we talk about Kristallnacht and the events that followed in moving to Kenya, tell us first a little bit about your family's life before Kristallnacht, before those early years when Hitler came to power, what your family's life was like.
They had a very happy life. My parents got married in 1926, I think. Is that possible? Yes, I think so. And they lived in a small town outside of Cologne, where my grandfather and my father and his brother and grandmother lived. My mother moved to Leschenich to be with them. And things were fine. They had a very happy life. They were close to Cologne. If they wanted to go out, they went to Cologne. And they had very good relationships with non-Jewish people, a lot of them. And they were very well liked. And the family goes back to that area. I saw one genealogy that I don't have, but I saw the first name of a family member was in the 1600s. And all it says is his name, C-A-I-N, which is a biblical name. And there were many, many relatives. My grandmother came from 8 children. So
a huge extended family.
Yes.
Yeah, huge extended family.
I didn't know how huge it was until someone showed me a genealogy maybe 10 years ago. It was just huge, and on that genealogy there was like a line of people missing after the war.
After the war.
Very few people left.
And as you said, the family went back centuries, so the roots in the community were just very
deep. And their reputation was really quite excellent. And there were a group of non-Jewish people who ran an underground to help our parents. And I believe it must have started in 36 or 37. But then when Kristallnacht came, that was all off the table.
Before we turn to Kristallnacht, tell us about your father. What was your father's occupation?
He was a cattle dealer.
Cattle dealer. And you told me that you saw some documents that showed that after the Nazis came to power, you could actually see the decline in their revenue that really affected their business even before Kristallnacht.
I had in my possession, which I've lost somehow, 2 postcards. The first one came from the Nazi regime in 1937 that they were to do no more business. And no, it was something else, something relating to something forbidden. I can't remember exactly. But the second card stated, you shall now, everything that you own officially now belongs to the Reich. That included farmlands, housing, whatever people owned belonged to the Nazis. And that's kind of a message. Either you get out or they couldn't possibly imagine the Holocaust, but they wouldn't have been able to survive without being able to make a living for long.
Yep.
And they were quite wealthy by the time. It wasn't just my parents, it was a family business of 4 or 5 men. And it was just impossible, an impossible situation. So very early on, my father, when they closed him down in 1937, he spent a whole year traveling around trying to get out of Germany, finding openings, finding ways of getting into a country. And it wasn't possible. We had no friends or relatives in the United States.
So this was not an option for
It
you?
wasn't an option. They wanted to come to the United States. And one of his cousins, who was not in the business, married a woman from a very, very brilliant intellectual family. They had a son. She had a brother, a cousin. It was either a cousin or a brother, who went to the University of Munich. And it was 1922, I believe, very early. He saw Hitler on the street giving a speech. Very early, not 22, but very early. And he decided right that day that he was not going to stay in Germany. And he got in touch with his family and he told them that it's the day he graduates, the next day he's leaving. And he went to England. And he was a wonderful person. His hobby was helping Jews getting out of Germany. And we lucked out with that family relationship.
And you're going to tell us more about
yes.
that a little bit. Jill, one of the many restrictions, besides taking away your businesses and your ability to have a livelihood, all kinds of restrictions were being imposed by the Nazis. One of them was that you were forbidden to keep kosher. Yet your family, at considerable risk, continued to do that. And you shared with me how they did that. Would you mind saying a little bit?
They did it defiantly. Mm-hmm. That's how they did it. They had guts. I mean, 2 or 3 of my uncles were kosher slaughterers. That was forbidden. They continued doing it. They hid calves in the attic. And one of the uncles, who was actually the butcher, decided he was going to kill big animals. And he had a very trusting worker who helped him. And they had an abattoir, you know, mm-hmm. And he was, he couldn't do he did the kosher slaughtering, mm-hmm. and then shot into the head so that his Nazi neighbors could hear that he killed with a gun.
By gunshot, yeah.
Yeah. Of course, this was terribly risky. They didn't realize really how risky it was until what happened on Kristallnacht.
In fact, and you told me that they would hide the knives,
yes.
Hide them up in the chimney.
In our house, my uncle strapped them inside the chimney. And they did 2 raids in our house because people knew. And Nazis came in and they opened the drawers for the cutlery.
But it was well hidden.
They didn't find them.
So, Jill, November 9th through 10th, 1938, the night that we call the Night of Broken Glass or Kristallnacht, what do you remember of that night and know about that night as how it affected your family? What happened that night?
It affected me to the point where 81 years later, I remember it clearly. Mm-hmm. You know, you forget a lot of things in life, but
not something like that.
No.
Yeah.
Nobody knew anything at all. No one. They did not announce that this was going to take place, even to the non-Jewish world. So, at about 9 o'clock in the morning, my sister had gone by train to school in Cologne. The train came back to Cologne, and my mother saw her out the window. She was on the train, and she couldn't figure out why she was coming back. Had no idea. And a little bit later on, somebody knocked on the door. And it was a friend of the family. And he told my father, do not go to the synagogue today. And he was about to turn around and leave, and my father said, why? He said, just listen to what I told you, do not go there. And he took off. He had some managerial job in the town government. And then the phone started ringing. And relatives in other parts of the spread out a far area called and told them what was happening. And they didn't know, they started screaming and yelling and shouting, and they didn't know what to do. They would just, one of my uncles went outside, he wanted to close the shutters. And my grandmother said, it's too late to close shutters, you can leave them open, we're running away. We're leaving. Leave everything, we're running. And how do you run? You know, you had to have vehicles to run with. So there was a family car. I don't know why we couldn't use that. I guess they were afraid to use that. I know now. Mm-hmm. The men in the family got into that car and drove around the area for 24 hours. And at night they went into the woods. They hid themselves. So my father had to get other drivers to get us to Cologne. And he hired a man who was willing to do it. You know, you had to have the right connections. They were getting smaller and smaller. Mm-hmm. And this man did do it. I suppose my father paid him well. And when my sister and I came out the front door, we smelled smoke and we saw stuff flying around in the air. And it was probably the synagogue burning, and we saw flames and we started screaming. We were terrified. So my grandmother grabbed us and put us in the car and put us on the, what do you call that, right on the bottom of the car, with our faces down. On the floor,
put you on the floor of the car.
He put us on the floor with our faces down, and we stopped screaming. But we had to stay that way until we got to the outskirts of Cologne. And when we were quiet, she let us get out. But I remember seeing flames, fires, not close, but far, all around the horizon of the car. It was dusky, but you saw the flames. We drove into the city, and it was dark, and we went into an apartment that was occupied by 4 of my mother's my mother's aunts and uncles, my great aunts and uncles. And all of a sudden we became 12 in that apartment. The men didn't show up, they kept going until Friday, Kristallnacht, I think it was on a Thursday. Mm-hmm. Friday around noon they showed up in Cologne. And I remember eating in the dining room, and the men planning where to hide in case there's a knock on the door. I found that very interesting, you know. I mean, I remember it, so
You remember that, yeah.
I remember them planning to stay in the apartment and hide. Mm-hmm. But nothing happened during the meal, nobody knocked. And then the next day, my father finds out that there's an empty apartment in the top floor of that building, and he took us up there. He was going to rent that to hide. Mm-hmm. And God was with us that time. My sister had a screaming nightmare. She was afraid after all that. She was older, she understood more than I did.
She's 4 years older than you.
Yes. And so he said, well, I can't stay here either. So this was like from Saturday to Sunday. So on Sunday, 3 of the men decided that's what they needed the family car for. They drove into Holland. We lived 1 hour from Holland. And they were caught. And they were put in prison.
Once they got to Holland, they were caught, right?
Yes.
Over the border, and they
Yes.
got, yeah.
I believe that there were about 30,000 Nazis in Holland. So they were stuck. But I had 2 uncles who had left Germany early, 2 uncles and an aunt, who moved to Holland because they couldn't make a living in Germany anymore. Couldn't make a living in Holland either. It was tough, very hard. And one of these uncles was a young man at that time. He was about 26 or 27. And he was a Dutch partisan. That's what he was. And he helped people escape Germany, bring them over. He was very daring. They swam over. And he would sit at the beach, and he had newspapers with him and raincoats. And he would hardly speak to them, just hand them a raincoat, a paper, and say, sit down here and read. And he would leave. And then they would disperse. So this uncle was also, the family also had a good connection with a Jewish man who met one of my uncles on vacations in the mountains. I don't know if they were German mountains or Swiss mountains, but they met on vacation. And he's the man who advised the family to get their money out of Germany early. And my grandmother agreed with him.
This was even before Kristallnacht, right?
Yes, way before,
Way
when I was
before.
born.
Yeah,
The day I was born, May 1, 1933, Hitler came to power. And on that day, the family hired a smuggler who took their money, and it was a lot of money, into Holland. And this gentleman that I'm speaking about, this friend, took care of the money. He was very honest. And it helped, it helped us
Hugely, right?
get out, yes.
Jill, for our audience, I just might say that Kristallnacht was a series of vicious attacks against Jews all over Germany and Austria. On that night, more than 300 synagogues were burned, including yours. More than 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and arrested and essentially given the choice of staying incarcerated or leave the country if they paid some money. It was a horrific night. Jewish businesses were destroyed everywhere. So your father and a couple of uncles are now in Holland. They've been arrested.
We were stuck.
You were stuck.
We were stuck in Cologne.
And those events, though, propelled the family immediately into saying, we're going to get out of Germany.
Wherever they could go.
So tell us what happened then to be able to make the arrangements to leave Germany.
The arrangements to leave Germany, we found out, were already in process. But who in 1939 would think of going to Africa? Not many people. But this lady who married into the family, the brother of that courageous guy who heard Hitler speak, graduated law school in England, and he sent his brother to Kenya. He had a connection in Kenya, and they hired his brother. He got him a job.
In Kenya?
In Kenya. And that became...
Is this your Uncle Herman in England? Was that Uncle Herman that was in England?
No.
No, okay.
He was in Holland.
He was in Holland, okay.
Yeah. Herman was in Holland, yeah. And where was I?
About the family member who's now practicing law in Kenya.
Yeah. So there was a lot of movement there because this relative was adamant, this woman, Rose, to get out of Germany with her baby. Her husband didn't want to go. He wasn't afraid. You had a lot of people like that. He wasn't in a hurry. Kristallnacht changed his mind. But by then, the efforts were being made already. And that helped the men in Holland. They were incarcerated for 9 months. And the papers came through. And by the permission of the Queen, they were allowed to leave.
And there's a little story there.
Yep.
Tell us how they got the Queen of Holland to...
The same man that had met my uncle in the mountains, he was the court Jew to the Queen of Holland. That meant he was the only Jewish person who was allowed to go into the court and meet with the Queen. And he got her to sign the papers.
That released your
to release them from prison, let them be in a camp, and then after 9 months in the camp, the papers came through. So my father and his brother and a cousin were in Kenya ahead of us. And the separation was a terrible thing for my father. I found out many years later that he had a nervous breakdown in the camp. Everything he had was in Germany. And then in Germany, the 9 months in Germany, I remember quite a bit of that.
What, those 9 months that you were forced to live there without your father before you left?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that before we move on.
Well, my sister and I, first of all, never had a bed. We slept on the floor, we slept in chairs. For 9 months, we didn't have a place to sleep, which makes children cranky. My sister went to school, but she didn't really go to school. She was very independent. She was on the subways. She would take...
In fact, you said she was outright defiant towards the Nazis.
Very. She took the money from my mother for the car fare, and she lined up wherever there were signs that said Jews not wanted. And that was dangerous. My mother had no way of stopping her. My mother didn't know where she was. And that's what happens when you send children away from home early. They get very independent.
Yes.
And she would take the money from the car fare. She didn't go to school. And with that money, she lined up to buy coffee and chocolate for my grandmother, who was dying of cancer, who was in the apartment with us. And nothing could stop her from taking care of her grandmother. So she did it. And then we also had several trips that we had to make to the Gestapo Amt, which was so deathly dangerous. I remember the Gestapo Amt. On one trip that we had to take, we were lined up. She was holding our hands, both of us. And she needed papers. I don't know if there were papers for Kenya, probably. And we're standing there, and at the corner out of my eye on the right-hand side was the Nazi guard with the troop uniform, with everything. And I hadn't seen those things ever up front. He started screaming, "All Jews out." She needed the papers. So we turned around and we shuffled out. And at the door, she turns around and she sees that the two Nazis were changing guard. One was leaving, the one that screamed at us, and another one was coming on. So she turned us around and she walked back. She didn't go out. And we got the papers.
You got the papers this time.
Yeah.
The papers, including your visas that you needed to be able to leave Germany to go to Kenya, they had to be purchased, and they were fairly pricey to be able to purchase those individual visas.
Everything we took out of the country that they bought, they had money left, and they went shopping, and they bought 7 lifts of stuff.
To take to Kenya.
Yeah, there were a lot of people. There were 18 of us, so a lot of stuff. And they were going to Kenya. They didn't know there were stoves in Kenya or whether there were ovens or not. They didn't know anything. Mm-hmm. So they bought a lot of stuff. Everything they bought had to be paid double. Everything Jews bought had to be paid double.
You had to pay, as I understand it, part of that was you had to pay 100% tax on every single thing that you hope to take out of the country. Mm-hmm. 100% tax on it.
And we didn't find out. I had to be taken to school when I turned 6. That was a nightmare. It was just 2 blocks away from where we lived, but my mother was terrified. And I think the fear was that she would come to school and I wouldn't be there. Mm-hmm. So I only went to school for 2 weeks. That's why I'm rather poorly educated. 2 weeks of German studies. I can't read German. Mm-hmm. And so she decided she's not going to take me anymore. So that was May 14th, and that was a dangerous decision. If someone found out, she would be badly punished. But she took the chance. And 2 weeks or so after my birthday, the papers came in for Kenya. So she felt safer, you know. So, and we left by the middle of June, 1939.
So as you said, that was about 9 months after Kristallnacht. And,
yes.
And those were really tough 9 months, but now you're ready to leave. As you said, your family had purchased a lot of goods, because you could still do that, pay a heavy tax on it at that time, in order to leave for Kenya. Describe for us what you can about what it was like then to leave. And as you noted earlier, by this time, your father and I think a couple of uncles had made their way to Kenya from Holland. Mm-hmm. So they were there a little bit ahead of you. So
it was a disaster. That the separation of the family was a huge family. There were about 60 people at the train seeing us off, and that was just...
Other family members?
Yeah, but that was just a fraction.
Mm-hmm.
That's how many cousins and uncles. My father didn't even know any second cousins. They were far removed. To me, a second cousin is like a real cousin. And I remember the sadness and the crying at the train, because my mother had this feeling that she would never see them again. Mm-hmm. And also going on the trains were very dangerous, because you were on there, you had the papers, but the papers could change overnight, and then they'd examine your passports every 5 minutes, and they'd say you're off. Mm-hmm. So that was a very, very big responsibility and frightening thing. I remember the train. We went from Cologne to Genoa, and it took a long time. We went through Switzerland, but one thing I remember, I had never seen my mother smile. And when the train got into Switzerland, she broke out in such a beautiful smile. I have never forgotten it. We were out.
Into a neutral country.
Right. Yeah. And once we got to Genoa, we had to get back on a Nazi ship. And she by then was a little recovered, I think, from all the fear. And
on this trip, Jill, there was a number of you. It included, I think, 3 of your grandparents,
yes.
and one of them was dying. She was dying.
And she saved our lives, because she was a very religious woman. Before we left Cologne, my mother said, when we got the tickets, my mother said to her, "Mama, you're so sick, and it's such a hot trip to Africa. Do you think you can make it. She said, I don't care if I don't make it. I'm not dying here. I'm leaving. If she had said, yes, you're right, we would have had to stay to take care of her. And we would have all lost our lives.
Just to mention for the audience, this was June 9th, 1939, and on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and World War II began at that point. So this is just right in the immediate run-up to the start of the war. So you have to board a German ship. You had to take a German ship. You were not allowed to take any money with you. You're on this ship. Now you're sailing to Africa. There's a lot you won't have time to tell us, but of course the commander of the ship, the captain of the ship, is a German officer, and he hears you sing. You have to tell us this.
When I got out of the Germany and we were on the boat, that was the first time in my life that I had sunshine. They kept me in the house so much, I was sun deprived. And I was so happy to be out in the air. I was sitting on something on the boat there, and I was singing. What was I singing? I was singing German, little German nursery rhyme songs, and I was singing Hebrew songs. And the Hebrew that I was singing was taught to me by my great uncle in Cologne to keep me busy. He learned with me and he sang with me, and he was he had an operatic voice. He sang at the opera. So here I was singing by myself. I wasn't singing to anyone else. And I was overheard. And the captain called my mother in and said to her, would you mind if your little girl would sing for the crew? Oh, God. They took us, our cabins were, below the deck. And my mother was angry at that. And there were the aunts and my grandmothers and my mother, and they're teaching me overnight to separate the Hebrew songs from the German song.
Right.
I think I did pretty well.
Singing these German folk songs.
Yes. I didn't sing any Hebrew songs. I must have understood.
They invited you back,
Then I was
right?
6. I was mature.
Yeah. and then they invited you back several times,
Oh,
right?
every day for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And my aunts who were on the boat were terribly concerned that something would happen to me, and they would stand guard. I don't know what they expected to do. I only remember doing it once. But my Aunt Elsie, who, she passed away 2 years ago. She was 100.
Wow.
And she said, no, dear, you did it the whole time.
So after singing your way on this cruise, a long 2-week cruise, you make it to Mombasa. There you are in Kenya. Tell us about arriving there.
I sort of remembered my father, of course, and my mother. We were so excited about seeing him. And it was so easy to pick him out. He was standing by the ship, and there were hundreds of people there, but he was the only one wearing European clothes. A suit and a hat and a white shirt. There wasn't anybody else. That was my father. But he soon changed that, and happily. And from there, life in Kenya began.
One more thing before you tell us
Yes.
about that. One of your grandfathers, despite the fact that you were on this German ship, he insisted on keeping kosher on the ship.
Oh,
Yes.
yes.
And then you arrived on the Sabbath, I believe, and he didn't want to get off the ship. So
we got him off the ship. We got him off the ship. I don't quite remember, but with the eating, he wouldn't. He told the aunts and my mother in Germany that if he didn't get kosher food on the ship, he wasn't going. Crazy. he knew the Jewish law. Just wasn't connecting properly. And he said, so what one of my aunts calls Berlin, and they delivered kosher food for all of us for 2 weeks to the boat, to a Nazi ship.
We
had to get my grandfather out.
in sort of those bizarre ironies that happen sometimes in these circumstances like that, you arrive in Kenya. It's really, at that time, it's a British colony. So you were instantly labeled enemy aliens by the British government.
Right, I was one too.
Yeah, explain that.
Of course, we didn't understand that. I didn't, and Inge didn't. But our parents had to.
Right.
We were limited in, they bought a farm right away. A 350-acre farm. They didn't have the money for the whole farm. They took out a mortgage. My grandfather said, this will never work. You're going to lose the farm. But it didn't. It was fine. It worked. And where am I?
Talking about the fact that the British, because you were...
we hadn't even gotten to the farm. We were all in Kenya maybe a month and living in this big house, boarding, and a van drove up and picked up all the men and put them in a camp. Enemy aliens.
Because they were German nationals in the British eyes. Yep.
But we found out here in this museum why we were angry for 50 years at the British for that. They had non-Jews steal Jewish identities and sneak into countries. And they had to make sure that we weren't those people.
And they were worried about spies,
yes,
and those kinds of things.
Yes.
So now, of course, many of the English that are living in Kenya, they are, because the war is on, they're now having to sign up for the army. So they're leaving the farms. So your family and other Jews in Kenya were then forced essentially to take over and run take care of the farms.
The Jewish farmers had to take over the non-Jewish farms because the women were left on the farms alone, and they had to help them. And my father had a farm between where we lived and where he had another field, which was, 8 miles away. And every day back from work, he bicycled. He would go to this other farm and make sure that everything was running normally. My uncle, his brother, had one where he could walk to the next farm and take care of that property. So that went on for the duration of the war.
And tell us about your education. I mean, it's time for you to go to school. You're in a new country, a new culture. Tell us about that.
For a child that came out of Germany that had never been inside a school or not even outside of the house a whole lot, going to school was really quite terror experience, you know. And in Kenya, this is so meaningful to me. We weren't there maybe 2 weeks. My mother and father were very concerned that we weren't getting education. We went to a school in Nairobi, but from where we lived, we had to go through the woods, take off our shoes and socks, walk over a creek, and then go to school. And I was still only 6. And the guides that took us were young black men. We didn't speak their language, they didn't speak ours. And my parents trusted them. And they were wonderful. They took us to school. They spoke to us in Swahili all the way to school. And then when they picked us up, they spoke Swahili to us all the way back. And this went on for 6 weeks. And we were fluent in Swahili. Children learned that language very easily. But then we had problems with the adults. They didn't, but they learned also.
They learned too. And on top of it, you had to learn. You were in an English school system, so you had to learn English on top of that.
And the teachers were vicious, very anti-Semitic, and vicious because children coming into your classroom that don't speak a word of the languages spoken there are double the work for them. But we weren't there very long because things changed. We went to the farm, and then we were sent to another school, and that didn't work out. It was too expensive. And then we went to school in Nairobi, to the primary Nairobi government school. They were excellent schools. And we were boarded with other families because my parents didn't want us to be boarding in the schools. And it worked. It was fine. The schools were strict. Inge, my sister, graduated from their high school and matriculated and was accepted in England by Oxford and Cambridge. And she was 17.
Wow.
I was nothing like that. I had other plans. I don't know what they were. But
Speaking of Inge, we had Jill and Inge together here a few years ago, and Inge had some different memories because she was 4 years old and 4 years older. And one of the things that she shared is that the time you were there in Kenya on the farm, you had a single during the war, you had a single battery operated radio. And that was really significant.
yes.
Tell us about that.
It was not to be used for anything other than the news from England in the evenings, because they couldn't keep it going. It was not easy to keep that radio going. And every evening we heard the news from Europe. And that's the only radio we had. And we had a gramophone. Somebody brought us a gramophone, you know, the kind that you wind up.
During that time you were in Kenya, during the war years, because you left after the war, were you able to, for any period of time, to have news or contact with family members back in Germany?
Yes. There were some letters.
There were some letters.
And they stopped in the end of 1940.
That was the end of it.
And one thing that I am grateful to God for is that my first grandmother died in Kenya 6 months after we got there. And my second grandmother died in 1945, I think in February or March, because had she found out that everybody in her family was murdered, it would have been a disaster. This way we had the peace of knowing that she cried for them in her sleep. And thank goodness she didn't know.
During that time, did you know what was happening to Jews in Europe at that time?
Well, we heard about it, but you know, hearing about it when I was, how old was I? War was over. I was 12 when the war was over. And I thought it was awful, but I didn't really understand it properly. I started to understand it on the ship coming here.
Coming to the U.S.
Yes. Somebody brought my father a book of pictures from the concentration camps as a gift. And both of my parents started to cry, and I wanted to see what was in the book. And they said, no, you're not to open it. But I did. And I became enraged. And that rage never went away. And they took the book and they threw it overboard. They couldn't deal with it.
That was 1947. Tell us about the decision to leave Kenya after you'd gotten yourself established there and moved to the United States, 1947.
Oh, that was easy. They made a decision that they couldn't get into the States. So they lived in Kenya. And when it became possible, when two of my mother's cousins were in the United States Army, that made them citizens. And, right? And they were then able to vouch for us, to come in, sponsor us. And it was very smooth, it was very positive, everybody wanted to go, and everybody did. Not all on the same ship, on different ships. We came in on cargo boats.
On cargo boats, but the whole family came from Kenya to here. And when you, as you were leaving Africa, you were also leaving behind pretty dangerous times, because that was the time of the Mau Mau uprising against the government.
In 52.
That happened in 52, so the events were leading up to it, right?
And they did lose all the money that they paid for the farm because of that.
Because of that.
Because they hadn't sold it. They didn't sell it because they didn't know if they would permanently stay in the States.
Right.
That was a mistake. They made a lot of mistakes, but thank God they made some good decisions
Some good decisions. And so before we turn to our audience to see if they have a few questions, so yet again, you've picked up stakes and moved to an entire new country. You speak the language because of your English education in Kenya,
Yes.
but you are now, your parents are faced with the dilemma of how do we earn a living?
Right.
What did they do?
They bought a chicken farm. And not a good idea. My father was allergic to chickens. But it's a HIAS in New York, which is an organization that helped immigrant Jews find a place to be and how to make a living. They suggested it. And he told them, but I'm allergic to chickens. They said, doesn't matter. And it did matter. He couldn't handle it. He had to hire people to help him. And nobody liked the chicken farm. And let me see, how long did it take him? But he couldn't be with the chickens.
Yeah.
And he got very sick when he came to America. And then when he healed out a year or two later, he said, the heck with this stuff. He started buying cattle again.
Which is what he knew, cattle.
That's what he knew, and he did very, very well.
Well, Jill, do you think we should take some questions from our audience?
Okay.
Okay. We have two microphones, one in each aisle. We ask that if you have a question, you go to the microphone, make your question as brief as you can, and I'll repeat it just to be sure that we hear it. And while we're looking for a brave soul to come up and be the first person to ask a question, here, that didn't take long at all.
Hi, my name is Trevor. I'm from Vermont. And earlier you mentioned that God was with you in regards to your father renting the apartment. And I'm just wondering, through an event like this in your life, how you kept your faith and how, looking back, you keep your faith.
Jill, in light of all that you went through, how have you managed to keep your faith?
It got stronger for some reason. Got much stronger. You have to have something to hold on to in life. Remember that movie, what's the name, with Mary Poppins with the umbrella? That was my mother. She hung on to God.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi. I was wondering if you're aware of how serious it was at the time since you were so young.
Aware of how serious it was?
Yeah.
Yes. Good question. Were you aware as a youngster, especially as you're in Germany preparing to go? Did you understand how serious matters were?
No. I was depressed. I figured that out very late in life. I really was very depressed. In Cologne, in an apartment with old people, nothing to do, couldn't go out on the street. I became depressed, and I had a very light sort of personality, and I became morose and angry. I remember.
You remember that? Okay, we'll go here, then over to here. Yes.
Hi, Bruce from Iowa. After you had already fled anti-Semitism in Germany, did it surprise you to find anti-Semitism at your new school in Kenya among English-speaking teachers?
After having experienced anti-Semitism in Germany, to go to Kenya and then experiencing there, was that a real surprise to you to experience anti-Semitism?
No, of course not.
No.
They were used to it. I, as a child, wasn't used to it. I had plenty of it in school. But the family, no, they kept, there were 16 of them or 17 of them. And I don't know, can't count, there was some off the farm and on. We were at least 15 people on the farm. They had each other. There were 2 big houses. And there was a lot of company. My parents were very social. And people came to visit, and when they ate my mother's food, they wanted to come back. So my mother and father opened a bed and breakfast, besides the other work on the farm, and because they had to pay tuition for us, and it was high.
Go ahead, Jill, I'm sorry.
So they sort of had a family, what do you call it, like a kibbutz. People came from Nairobi. Those who wanted to come came. Those who didn't like it never came again, but most of them came back. We had visitors as far as from Mogadishu who came and stayed on the farm. The farm where we lived was high up in the mountains, 7,500 feet high. And on a clear day, you could see Kilimanjaro from one end of the farm and Mount Kenya from the other.
In fact, Jill, you
So it was gorgeous.
You shared with me that British troops actually came, officers came and used your bed and breakfast for R&R for them. And then later in the war, U.S. troops came and...
Yeah, the U.S., they were too late.
They were too late?
Yeah, they were too late. They didn't make it to the farm. It was too
Okay.
far. But the Brits came, and South Africans, and I don't know if we had an Australian, I don't think so. But whoever got into the British Army, some of them were Jewish, many of them were not. They came with the Jews, and they loved my mother's cooking. I remember fondly one young man, he was the driver for a captain or a colonel in the army, and they came together, and he was Scotch. And he became so attached to my sister and I and to my mother. He was just such a wonderful young man. He always came back, he liked my mother's noodle kugel. And then one day he came and he said that he was being shipped out. And it was North Africa, you know, the fight in North Africa. And he died, he got killed. And it's something that stuck with me for life.
We are close to the end, so we're going to try and get through your questions as quickly as we can. So, yes, sir.
Well, hello, my name is Julian. I'm from Colombia, and I've worked with victims from conflict in my country.
What?
And it's hard for me to hear your testimony of how you suffered. And I want to ask you, what would be your piece of advice for people that nowadays are enduring war in my country?
If I'm hearing that correctly, what's your advice to people who are currently suffering through oppression and the things that you went through? Is that?
Yeah.
I can only tell you that the right thing to do is to get out if you can. You just have to find a place that will take you. It's always been that way. It took my father 10 years to get into the United States. And during those 10 years, we were in Africa for seven, and the other 3 we were waiting in Germany. You have to try and get out.
Thank you. Then I'll come over to you. Is that okay? Yes, sir.
Okay. So during after you left Kenya, and went to the United States, did you experience any culture shock or any experience of any hardships?
We had some very unhappy culture shock and some very funny culture shock.
Here in the United States?
Of course.
Yeah.
And in Kenya, too. Yeah.
Yeah, so you had culture shocks here as well. A lot of different cultures, yeah. I'm sure we could probably hear some really good stories out of that. Maybe, let me just mention that Jill's going to stay with us for a while afterwards, and maybe we can get her to talk about some of those to you. Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I was wondering how you met your husband.
Great question.
Oh, that was nice. Had nothing to do with the war, and yet it did. Because our backgrounds are very similar. And a friend came to my sister and he said, I have this really nice guy. I'd like to introduce him to your sister. And my sister said, well, you know, I don't know if my sister's interested. He says, you know, he's perfect. He never talks and she never shuts her mouth. And we met, and truly that was right. You know,
And true love. True love. Yes, sir.
My name's Kyle, and I'm from Washington, D.C. And my question is, more recently in life, did you start publicly speaking about your family's experiences, or periodically through the years, have you always been pretty open to talking to strangers from all over the country and the world?
Question, did you catch that, Jill? The question is, have you always spoken about what you went through, or is that something that you have begun to do later in life?
I don't know. It just sort of, it morphed when the museum opened. We decided to volunteer. We started in 1992. And then I met an awful lot of survivors, and everybody had a different story. And I was part of the beginning of the Speakers Bureau because people wanted to hear the different stories, and that's how it started. And no, I don't go around. I live in New York now, been there 3 years, I've spoken once, and I don't want to do it. I just feel comfortable doing it here.
And I might just mention that Kurt, who will be here with us tomorrow, Jill's husband, only spoke for the first time publicly 2 years ago, after all those years, so different experiences. I want to thank all of you very much for being with us, for great questions. We will close our 2019 program year tomorrow with Kurt. We'll resume again next March. All of our programs are available on the museum's YouTube page, so you can see them. We hope you'll come back next year and join us again at some point. I'm going to turn back to Jill in just a moment to close the program. When Jill's finished, will remain on the stage. Lolita, our photographer, is going to come up on stage and take a photograph of Jill with you as the background. So we want you to stay because it's a really terrific memento for Jill. And then when Jill's done, she will remain on the stage, and we invite anybody who would like to come up and ask her another question. Just say hi, take a photograph with her. Please take advantage of that if you'd like to do that. That'll be after Jill's finished. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word. And so on that note, I'm going to turn to Jill to close today's program.
I'm awfully happy to be able to be here at my age. A lot of my friends who are survivors are passing on. And it's very important for people to listen, to learn. And I'm happy to bear witness.